Hi folks, Matt Easton here of Scholar Gladiatoria. Now this is a shout out to Owen Ward, who left a question underneath one of my posts on our Facebook page, link below, and he asked me to make more videos about the migration era, now which I'm happy to do and which I will do. This isn't exactly what he's asked for. This is really a short video just to explain what the migration era or migration period was. It's occurred to me that over the course of the last few years since I've been making videos, I often refer to the migration era without qualifying what that is. Now, I studied this period at university and indeed at school as well, and so therefore I kind of make certain assumptions about what other people know, but not necessarily everybody out there knows what it is. And yes, it's easy to Google it, and I encourage you to do so if you want to learn more about the topic, but this is really in a nutshell to explain what the migration era or period was, but also something that you might not get from Googling, which I'll get to in a moment. So first of all, the migration period was essentially the period of a few hundred years that came after the contraction of the Roman Empire. Now, a lot of people refer to the fall of the Roman Empire, but what you have to realize is that the Roman Empire did actually continue until 1453 as the Byzantine Empire. So there was a continuity of Roman Empire right the way into practically the Renaissance in Europe, and of course fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, Constantinople. And so you have to think more about a contraction of Roman military power and cultural power rather than necessarily just suddenly a vacuum. However, the effects were more or less the same, because if you take somewhere like Britain, for example, even if you take somewhere like France, which was not quite so immediately affected by the contraction of the Roman Empire as Britain was, for example, there was nevertheless a sort of vacuum effect that was left in terms of power and governance. Okay, so if you imagine the country that you're living in now, suddenly the ruling elite and the government, and that includes everything, so you think about economy, military, the politicians, everything, okay, everything that runs the country that you live in, imagine if they just suddenly went away. It's kind of impossible to, for most people at least in the developed world, it's impossible to kind of imagine how things would pan out if that happened. Some of you, possibly even me, would quite like to see that happen in some of the countries we live in, because we're sick of the elites that we currently live under. But if you imagine that happening in the 5th, 6th century, 4th century, 4th through to 6th century, depending where you are in Europe, then this is really what happened. And now, the other thing we've got to say about the migration period is the name. Okay, so migration period, it is what it says on the box. It's a period during which it is assumed, and there is a fair amount of evidence to suggest that there was a lot of migration. What do we mean by that? Immigration, emigration, okay, movement of peoples. But it's not quite as simple as that. Migration of people is one thing, but there was also a migration of power and ideas and religion and culture and language. So this is where we get to the complicated part of the migration period or migration era. And that is the fact that in different parts of Europe at different times, we sometimes might be seeing a change of population, and at other times we might be seeing more of a change of culture. Now, to explain, when I went to university in the 1990s, I think 95, I first went to university. I started actually archaeology in 1997. So I studied archaeology from and medieval history from 97 until 2000. I was at University College London, and I became aware, well, we were taught this, but it became very evident very quickly that different universities, their outlook on this period of history was different based on who the teachers were, who the lecturers were, most of whom were published authors on the subject, or at least researchers. And there are different schools of thought. Now, obviously, my main sphere of study was Britain, the British Isles in general. But actually at school I had studied Charlemagne quite a bit as well, and I did go on to study the Franks more at university, and in fact I took part in excavations on Merovingian sites in northern France. So I have seen the French side of things as well. I am less aware of the intricacies of this period in other parts of Europe, but I do have some knowledge of it, and I'll talk about that in a second. Now, Britain and France are very different and contrasting cases when we talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, or the kind of the contraction of the Roman Empire away from what was then Britannia and Gaul. Okay, now remember, they weren't England, Scotland, and the other parts of Great Britain and France at that time. The names of those places are inextricably connected to the migration era. Just to focus on that point for a second, France takes its name from the Franks, we'll talk about those, and England takes its name from the Angles, we'll talk about those, and Scotland takes its name from the Scots. Now, those people on paper, okay, not genetically and not in reality, but on paper, the Angles came from outside of Britannia. They actually came from what's kind of the Netherlands and Denmark. And along with the Jutes and the Frisians and the other groups of people who supposedly migrated, well, did migrate, but we don't know how many. I'll come back to that. The Scots were a tribe of people who essentially came partly from Northern Ireland. The Picts were predominantly the Pictish culture was predominant in what is now Scotland. So Scotland literally takes its name from the Scots, who were essentially an incoming power. We won't necessarily say an entire population, and I'll talk about the genetic side of things in a second. And the Franks, of course, were a Germanic group that came from further in the east, basically the borderlands with Germany and into what's now Germany. Of course, Germany didn't exist then. And they supposedly moved in and took over Gaul and created what we now know as France. But it's far more complicated than that. So what you see is, when you study this period, there is a big divide between the academics, between those who believe that what we see is a very big population shift, in other words, a very big migration, which gives us the migration period title, and those who believe that actually what we see is a migration of cultural ideas and ruling elite. And obviously those are two different things. Now, if we zoom forward in time, if we look at the Norman conquest for a second, it's very evident that from all of the genetic testing that's been done, linguistic and all sorts of other historical data we've got to do with landowning from Domesday Book and such like, it's very obvious that the Norman conquest was a conquering by a ruling elite who then ruled over what was England and later became the whole of Britain, a ruling elite made up of Norman and other French, not only Norman, also Breton and other people from other areas of France, a ruling elite that became known as, you know, the Anglo-Norman rulers who spoke French. And they introduced certain words into the language, they introduced certain changes to the religion, the way that buildings were built, you know, different styles of fortification, different styles of church, different manners of warfare, horses, rabbits, all sorts of things they brought with them. So there were changes that happened in the British Isles as a result of this conquest. But the population of England, should we just limit it to for a second, the population of England didn't really change as a result of the Norman conquest, because the injection of ruling elite was such a tiny number of people relative to the rest of the population. So in genetics terms, made almost no difference. But what some people argue, if we go back, further back by 500 years thereabouts, into the migration period, is that in some areas, and obviously in my studies England has been the one which has been most focused on, in England there was an actual population shift. Now, you have to bear in mind that when I was studying at university, this was in the mid-90s, and genetic research was really in its embryonic stages. It's funny because I remember people thinking, wow, look at all this amazing data we can now harvest and come to great conclusions. And since that was being done, I mean, I knew people who were involved with this back in the late 90s, and there were documentaries, TV documentaries made about it at the time that are now horribly outdated and wrong in many cases. You know, when I look at the conclusions that were drawn in the late 90s and kind of around the year 2000, they have been completely overwritten, or not completely, but they've been very largely overwritten and clarified and changed in the last 20 years. And that's largely because our understanding of human sort of ancestry, DNA, and how to understand the data that we're harvesting, and to be able to harvest a more detailed set of data as well, looking at more of the genetic information available, we're getting a much more complex picture. And what we found essentially is that the story just in the British Isles, which is obviously just an island, and you know, could be perhaps more simpler than it would be on continental Europe, where people are it's more easy to migrate because there's not a sea around it. Even the story just in the British Isles is really complicated, and it's very difficult really understanding exactly what was happening in which areas. And of course there's no written records, and that's one of the defining features of the migration era. We're pretty much limited to archaeology, now scientific research in terms of genetics, and lastly some amount of history from outside of the area. So we get some information, some from later Anglo-Saxon sources admittedly, and there are a very small number of sources from the period, but also sometimes sources from outside of the areas that we're necessarily studying, but they're talking about that area. So for example, you know, Byzantine sources talking about the British Isles. To bring this back around, the migration era, yes, there was a lot of movement of people. There was also a lot of movement of ideas. There's always this balance between, okay, and this is an example from archaeology, if we have 100 graves from the year 400, and then we have 100 graves from the year 500, and their jewellery has all changed from being the old style to a new style, and the new style has its closest parallels in Germany, does that mean all the people are German? No. Does it mean that some of the people might have been German and there might have been immigration from Germany? Yes, it could mean that. But we can't assume that. It's a very complicated but also fascinating topic. But it does mean, and this is I guess one of the main points I want to make in this video, when you're looking at the migration era, not only are there a lot of unknowns, but whenever we get a lot of unknowns, there is also a lot of argument and controversy. But also, in between those things, a lot of very interesting research to be done. And we're constantly learning new things. It has to be said, in recent years, largely as a result of DNA, of genetic research. So, in the British Isles, overall, the conclusion, for those of you who are like, yes, Matt, but what actually happened? Well, as far as I know, the best, as far as I understand from everything I've read, the current understanding is that yes, there was an immigration of a not inconsiderable number of people from what would now be Germany, the Netherlands and part of Scandinavia into parts of England, but not all of England, into parts of England in the aftermath of the Romans leaving, or the contraction of the Roman Empire. However, that's complicated by the fact, now we're going to come around to the Franks, that there is a period where it's not simply indigenous people, the Romans go, and new people arrive. There is an overlapping period during which the Roman Empire was struggling to police and guard its borders. In terms of physical archaeology on the ground in Britain, one of the best examples of this are the so-called Saxon shore forts. And they are around the southeast corner of England, and it's a series of large Roman forts that were built in the 4th centuries to defend against attacking waves of barbarians, presumably some of these people who later became settlers. Somewhat like Viking raids, I suppose, but these were, as far as we know from the sources and the archaeology, these were people predominantly from Denmark, Netherlands and Germany in terms of England. And in terms of France, it was obviously not across the sea, it was across land into France. It was predominantly Germanic tribes, but there were also others, and there were other groups of people from further east, much further east in some cases, who would occasionally kind of move across, like the Huns, for example, who would occasionally move across or into bits of Western Europe. So there was obviously a conflict, but also mixing that went on there. Now, as I mentioned, the situation between Britain and France was somewhat different, and where it differs is, so we've got this overlapping, we've got under that happily living peacefully under the Roman Empire, theoretically, and then you've got the Roman Empire's gone out of these areas, but those bits overlap, because in this period when the Roman Empire was struggling to deal with its border control, it basically hired or recruited or absorbed people into its military and its administrative and population that were from outside of the borders, as it were. And the most famous examples of these are Germanic mercenaries. And we end up with this, I believe they're called foederati. So in the late Roman period in Gaul, we have these foederati who are essentially a bit like, if you imagine German warlords who are going, well, yeah, you know, we're not, instead of being a threat to you, if you pay us a certain amount, we'll come and protect you from those other thugs over the hill. And so there was a period where where the Roman Empire absorbed Germans and various other people to protect its borders against other German and other people. People say, you know, well, was the situation in Gaul the same as the situation in Britain? Was it that in both cases they took some of the Germanic peoples and other, maybe Slavic in some cases, people to come and protect their borders, and then once the Romans essentially gave up and contracted back to southern Europe, did they then just sort of, could they not handle it anymore, and there was big wave upon wave of migrating people, or was it just more of a steady thing, or was it more of a peaceful thing? We just don't really know, and it's undoubtedly also different situations in different areas, and we see this in the genetics incidentally. For example, Germanic, sort of German and Dutch relationships between Germany and Netherlands and England are closer. There seems to be much more of a stronger genetic link between the Netherlands, Germany and England than there is with France, for example. France seems to be more of a separate grouping with less intermingling. Lastly, we shouldn't forget to accept the effect of statistics as well, and population size has a huge effect on what we see in the genetic data. So if an area has a very small population and a small migration comes in, it might make a big genetic impact on that area because that population's size was tiny already. I think we probably see this in the later kind of with Viking effect on places like the Shetland Isles and things like that. But in terms of Gaul, what we may have seen a fair number of Franks and Alemanni moving from Germanic areas into what was then Gaul and is now known as France. However, if the population size of the Gauls was very, very big, then we might see very little, relatively speaking, smaller amount of genetic impact on the indigenous population. Not that anyone's really indigenous, because everyone in history has migrated from somewhere else to begin with anyway. Right, so I'm going to wrap it up there. That was much longer and more rambling than I intended. This was supposed to be a 2-minute video, but you know, that's I guess the way I am. But the migration era is incredibly complicated, and in some ways also quite simple. If we're just going to keep it simple, it's just a period during which there was a slight power vacuum, and so other groups moved in, other groups took over and created new power structures and brought with them new language, new religions in some case, new culture, physical culture in terms of what they wore, the weapons they used, the style of houses they lived in, style of fortifications, the way they fought, stuff like this. So in academia, there is always this tussle between, is it a migration of people or is it a migration of culture? And inevitably the answer is somewhere between the two, and that there isn't one answer for all places at all times. In some places it may have been pure out ethnic cleansing and wiping out of the local population and replacing them with new people. And at the other end of the spectrum, we know this is the case in some places, and we know that ethnic cleansing happened as well because it's documented. In some cases, we know that people just moved in and happily mingled in with the native population, maybe influenced their language and their culture, but basically just mixed in peacefully. And there's everything in between that as well. And as we know from the later Viking era, sometimes we know that sometimes people moved in peacefully to begin with, and then it became conflict kind of grew from there. And in other situations, again, from that same period of history, we know that sometimes people arrived aggressively, warlike, to conquer, and then that didn't quite pan out, and then they just stayed and mingled in with the native population. So all sorts of complicated things were going on in the migration era, but there were definitely migrations of things, both people and ideas and religions and cultures and clothes and weapons and everything else. It's just that we can't always separate those. We can't always say whether it was more one or more other. Sometimes it's just a mixture of the two, and sometimes it's more one and sometimes it's more the other. About as clear as mud. I hope that was somewhat interesting. Obviously more of you who don't know about this period, but by all means read more about the migration era, because it's massively understudied and underappreciated part of history that's actually fascinating, and it's a real pioneer part of history where you can still find out new things that will change our ideas about huge, great topics and periods of time. And of course it's the basis, it's the foundation for modern Europe, the Europe that we live in now, or that I live in now anyway. And it explains how a lot of countries of Europe came to be. It's their birthplace. It's the beginning of their story after the Roman Empire ceased to be the main power in Europe. Anyway, thanks for watching. Give me a like if you didn't hate this video, and a subscribe if you want to see more like it. See you soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.